And thank you very much for the invitation to present at these hearings. I wish to begin by acknowledging the Ngunnawal people, the traditional owners of this country on which we're meeting. And I would like to use the opportunity of these opening remarks to note that the National Tertiary Education Union's interest in this topic is both general, as a union with a solid record of speaking out on matters of democratic governance, civil liberties and human rights, and specific in that treaties can have intended and unintended impacts upon higher education and research and the labour rights, and these matters are of course of direct interest to our members. The NTEU echoes the ACTU and other unions who have made submissions and those comments made by Andrew Detmer of the AMWU here today. And we echo these in our concerns with the breakdown of the Doha WTO round, with the growing proliferation on and significance and local impacts of the bilateral and multilateral agreements, such as the free trade agreements Australia has with the United States, Korea, and still negotiating with China. And of course the plurilateral negotiations on the ISDS in the Trans-Pacific Partnership and the Trade in Services Agreement, which I'll come back to later. The lack of transparency and public and parliamentary scrutiny of the negotiations is being done apparently on our behalf, but by our elected government, is unacceptable. Our public servants tell us that for specifically the TESA agreement, that Australia has taken, quote, full reservations on public education. But because the text is secret, none of us actually know what this set of words actually mean. And the only way we hear about what's going on is through leaks taken up through the media. So at the moment, Australia is named amongst New Zealand, Norway, Colombia and a couple of other countries as proposing to include private educational services in the agreement. We don't know whether that is a fact or not. The NTEU supports a clearer definition of public services in the TESA, which would retain the right of governments to provide and fund public services without being obliged to provide subsidies to private providers, particularly big foreign and multinational higher education for-profit providers. This, of course, is a particularly pertinent issue for the NTEU, when twice the Australian Senate has rejected legislation to deregulate university fees, and importantly, though, that legislation also contained clauses that sought to extend Commonwealth-supported places to private higher education providers. We would argue that the government must be able to give the Australian Parliament and public the assurance that it doesn't intend to let this slip through in the wording on public subsidies in the TESA. We congratulate the committee on picking up this topic of treaty making and are very hopeful of improvements, as we certainly do acknowledge that Australia has a very good record of reform on treaty making process over the last 20 years. But we believe it's time to put forward decisive reform to improve transparency and accountability in the exercise of the Executive's external affairs powers. We believe that this is only possible if the Commonwealth Government recognises and legally entrenches the approval of both Houses of Parliament as a condition of the exercise of executive power. We note a growing consensus amongst our best constitutional law experts about the need to extend parliamentary oversight of treaty making effectively to make treaties, and in particular Category 1 treaties, subject to the approval of both houses. The NTEU believes the best mechanism to lift transparency on a range of treaty process matters is through independent scrutiny, and we believe that this is best delivered through stronger and more robust parliamentary processes, evident, for example, in the work of this Senate committee, and potentially through strengthening the role and responsibility of JSCOT. We believe that these improvements require legislative expression. Expanding upon the recommendations made by the ACTU, we'd like to very quickly outline a case study on the 2007 US-Australia Treaty concerning defence trade cooperation and the subsequent implementing legislation here in Australia, which we elaborate upon in length in our submission. Unlike the FTAs, where there are continuous and sometimes poorly evidenced disputes about the economic implications for Australia, the NTEU looks to this example because the treaty has been proven to put Australian scientists at a legal disadvantage compared to their US colleagues. Furthermore, This case study demonstrates the basis for our recommendation 7, that parliamentary committees should be able to recommend a review of an international agreement on the basis of effective changes brought about by any subsequent negotiations or implementing arrangements prior to ratification. The treaty in question was signed on the 5th of September in 2007, implementing arrangements were signed on the 14th of March 2008, and the treaty was only tabled with the national interest analysis on the 14th of May 2008. None of these documents made any statements or arrangements in relation to the university sector. There was no acknowledgement that there would be impact upon universities and upon individual academic researchers. Ratification came on the 16th of May 2013, only after the implementing legislation was passed on the 31st of October 2012. However, the ramifications for academic research and researchers was widely criticised and led to a 2-year steering group led by the chief scientist to be established to improve the most dangerous elements of this legislation. In this case, the United States used the threat of non-ratification to compel domestic legislation that regulated dual-use technologies, a condition that Australia was not actually bound to according to neither the terms of the 2007 treaty nor the 1996 Wassenaar Agreement on Export Controls. Thus, the criminal liability that's now imposed on Australian scientists and other individuals involved in dual-use research extends well beyond the terms of the treaty. Further, the passage of inferior legislation, following, we presume, strong lobbying from the United States, has now been proved to have legally disadvantaged Australian scientists in comparison to their US colleagues. This case demonstrates that an important reason to lift parliamentary oversight in the Commonwealth treaty-making process, and in particular the provision for JASCOT to trigger pre-ratification reviews. It is to ensure that the standing of the Australian Government and the Australian Parliament is not diminished by foreign influence. The proposal really is quite modest. It is about ensuring that the national interest, economic, political, social, cultural, is in fact served. The Defence of Trade's control case demonstrates the potential influence of a foreign power upon domestic legislation and how that may extend well after a treaty is signed. We'd note that another example of this dilemma did occur in the relation to the 2004 Australia-US Free Trade Agreement, where the US demanded the introduction of the Copyright Legislation Amendment Bill 2004 to meet its interpretation of compliance, including commitments that weren't in the actual FTA text. And I know that other submitters have made that further points in relation to that. So lastly, in our submission, we have endorsed more robust processes for public consultation. We believe that the NIA should be constructed by an independent party. In some limited cases, the Productivity Commission may be an appropriate body. We also believe that measures should be introduced to compel and strengthen public consultation by DFAT with stakeholders during negotiations. On the subject of what these processes might look like, we would like to express our overt concern with the potential for Americanisation of the trade agreements process through the introduction of a US-styled industry trade advisory committees. The creation of approved industry groups is shorthand for undue corporate influence in trade agreement negotiations. Civil society groups and everyday Australians also deserve the right to access the same information and consultation processes that could be afforded businesses. Thank you for the opportunity to make these comments, and I look forward to questions.
Thank you for those submissions. The Australian government's been making trade agreements for over 100 years. And you've given us a case study there, which is evidence of a new evolving circumstance. So do I take from that that wasn't happening in the 60s, 70s? This is a new event? Is this a new thing that's come into trade agreements, the case study you've mentioned?
I'd like to be able to...
No, if you like,
So the process around which the United States has the opportunity to talk with Congress about the legislation that needs to be implemented in another country is generally called certification, and I think it's only been around since the mid-80s.
Okay.
I think Australia has largely been isolated from the experience of this until the Australia-United States Fair Trade Agreement, and we have, as we've demonstrated, a very significant example of that. So we can anticipate that this will happen again, and probably more frequently.
Okay, thank you. So